All right, so welcome to the invasive plant management session at the CERCAL conference. So it's the last session conference, and Michelle and I have both been traveling since Friday, and we're really tired. So please forgive us if we're not on point. I'm Justin Valliere. I'm a assistant professor at Woodlands Extension at UC Davis. I'm also here representing the California Invasive Plant Council. And our first presenter is Michelle Daneri, and she's going to tell us about some of her garlic mustard EDRR work. And Michelle is with the National Forest Foundation and is also a fellow member at the California Invasive Plant Council board. So, take it away, Michelle. You want to take care of
Thank you so much, Justin. Yeah, I'm going to put my microphone here. And thank you. Oops. We don't, no spoilers. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. Today I'm going to talk about garlic mustard EDRR across California. Pictured here is actually Lytle Creek in the San Bernardino National Forest. That's not where the infestation is, but I chose this picture because I think it really captures the way people and mountains are living closely together in Southern California, which can make weeds management quite difficult. But I just wanted to highlight that there.
You might need
Thank you.
try now.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, everyone. Got that together now. I'm with the National Forest Foundation. We're the congressionally designated nonprofit partner to the U.S. Forest Service. And while we're organized nationally, we're also organized into these local teams. And I'm a member of the Southern California field team. But in this particular project, I'm working across the state. I'll add that we're a small but mighty team, and we work on a lot of fuels reduction, invasive species treatment, and recreation projects in California National Forest, primarily the Southern Four. So a part of what we do is obtain funding, whether that's federal, state, private, and bring that to work on the national forests. And in this particular case, Scott Eliason, the Forest Service regional botanist, approached our program manager, Brian Roby, about some bipartisan infrastructure law funding to fund EDRR across California. And that's how we got involved. We're primarily based in the LA area, but we took on this project from everywhere, from the Six Rivers down to the San Bernardino National Park. And today I'm going to dive into more about garlic mustard in particular. Here I have a map that shows the two infestations across California. You see the top portion is in Trinity County, and the bottom infestation is in the San Bernardino National Forest. Those are the two infestations. There was another detection in Napa, but that was just a single plant as far as I know. And it's kind of interesting because in both of these infestations, you see a lot of parallels in that they're both along one creek shed, and they also span both Forest Service and neighboring private land. And that will, pose some interesting challenges. But I just wanted to share that. But they are two geographically separate infestations. Now I'm going to share a little bit more about garlic mustard itself. It is native to Europe and Asia and introduced to the United States. It's already very invasive in a lot of the United States, including the Midwest, Northeast, Northwest. And one problem with it is that it lives in our forest understory. And a lot of talks today this week have highlighted the importance of that understory and how challenging it is to restore it once it's disrupted. So I just want to note that this was a problematic species because of what it does to the forest understory. Another challenge with garlic mustard is that it is a biennial. In its first year, it is a rosette. And then in its second year, that's when it bolts and takes off. And a lot of times it is emerging in early spring and very much outcompetes our native vegetation. So again, that's another reason why it's problematic, because it has that early emergence advantage over our natives. A few other things about IDing it. It is, you can kind of, you'll see better in another photo, but basically it has these heart-shaped leaves that have a tooth margin. They emerge in clusters. They're very fragrant, given the name. And like many mustards, they have calyx that release a lot of seeds. One plant can release hundreds of seeds. And another challenge with this particular plant is that it has a 10-year seed bank, right? So we really need to think about long-term monitoring and management of this. But yeah, for many reasons, this one's problematic because, again, it has that long seed bank, it can spread very easily, and it has the allelopathic qualities that, again, keep our natives from taking hold. I'm going to cover our Shasta Trinity National Forest population first. It was first discovered in 2022. It was discovered by a Forest Service botanist, actually, from the East Coast, who luckily recognized the plant and knew that it should not be present there. So that's how that first plant got detected. And I want to note that early on, Calypsy sent out lead alerts for this particular plant just to get people like educated and mobilized. So that was a really important piece. That first it gets discovered in 2022, and people are aware of it, and that's when this new EDRR species went to the Trinity Weed Management Area Group. And they had a meeting in July 2024 to talk about how they were going to come together to work on this and better like map it. 12 attendees were there with the Yurok Tribal Fisheries, the Forest Service, Safe Alternatives for Our Forest Environments, Trinity County Natural Resources Division, Native Ecosystems, Inc., Watershed Research and Training Center, and the Trinity County Agricultural Department, and the BLM. So all these people were present thinking about how they were going to tackle this EDRR species when the Forest Service botanists made them all aware that National Forest Foundation, us, was funding an opportunity at the same time. So things kind of lined up. And it was really lucky for us because, as I had mentioned previously, I'm based in Southern California. And when I was trying to find an implementation partner out here, that was really challenging for me because I'm not based in the local area and didn't know who to reach out to. So due to all that organization that the WMA did, we got in touch with the Watershed Training Center and they became our implementation partner for this. So initially, the Forest Service had hoped that this project could include outreach to nearby communities and also treatments on private land. But unfortunately, this particular funding was restricted to Forest Service land. So already there were a little bit limited in how we were going to target this right away. But that being said, we decided to get started anyways. And I'll also note that 2025 was also a challenging year for federal funding. Right when we were hitting that treatment window, all our federal funding was frozen, not ideal. Also, we saw a lot of turnover at the agency, and that was challenging too. But I just want to give a shout out to the Shasta Trinity National Forest because Ashley Knight has stepped up into that role, and it's been really great. So although we had that like pause in funding and change in Forest Service representative, we've kept the project moving. So everyone's been really, adaptive in that way. But once they were able to get started, they did have to start a little later than planned because, again, funding was paused, but they focused on areas blanketed with garlic mustard seedlings. So that was their first tactic. But they then realized that they needed to shift their focus and actually focus on treating things in their second year, right? Before they were going to go to seed. And then that became the tactic to handle those populations instead, and then map the seedling, rosettes to come back to next. So that's ultimately the tactic that they employed, was to treat those second year plants and get a good mapping on things that needed to be treated next year. So the Watershed Training and Research Center secured funding from Trinity County to do that outreach and treatment at Rush Creek Estates. Because like I had mentioned, we have this map here. part of the populations on Forest Service land and other parts in a community. And by doing that, they were able to identify the initial population located on private property. And that initial source population is then seeding downstream. So now we've moved into 2026 treatments, and they've been focused on getting to the plants by early spring, which is an opportunity we didn't have last year. But luckily, they've been able to do that and prevent those seeds from being released. In this particular population, there's still a lot of work to do. We really want to keep this plant from spreading into, other watersheds. Now on to the San Bernardino National Forest down in Southern California. This garlic mustard here was first detected in 2020. So it's nearby the Deep Creek Wild and Scenic River, and California Botanic Garden was contracted to do botanic surveys in that area and first detected that garlic mustard, and everyone activated and assembled from there. So Duncan Bell from CalBG first discovered it. At that time, it was about 10 individuals. And basically from there, the Forest Service went out and mapped the population and found it at about 2.4 miles long. The first year treatment was this very concerted effort between the U.S. Forest Service, SoCal Mountains Foundation, the Urban Conservation Corps, San Bernardino County, and they all work together to treat both on the Forest Service and private land. Chris McDonald at UCANR played a really big role in securing some funding for them to treat, and that allowed the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District to start work there in May of 2022. So they were continuing those treatments, and then National Forest Foundation got involved around 2024. And in our first year of contracting out services, we worked with WRA to treat. And actually in 2025 last year, I had noted our challenges before. We actually didn't fund or coordinate the treatments in 2025 because it was so much of an obstacle. They kind of pursued funding and treatments on their own because of that pause in funding. But we're back out to supporting them this year. And IRCD and San Bernardino County are both working on the treatments, right? So the Resource Conservation District is funded by us to treat on Forest Service land, and San Bernardino County is treating on private land. Again, 2026 treatments revealed a reduction in population, but this particular species fluctuates a lot. And another really interesting thing about this infestation is it's a little bit limited in how it can spread because that side of the San Bernardino Mountains drops down into the Mojave Desert, and garlic mustard needs cold stratification. So we're luckily a little limited in how far down the mountain and it can spread, which is a positive on that front. I just want to show this map to show that this infestation spans both the Forest Service land, and then the darker color is the private land, just to kind of demonstrate how a funding approach that's going to let us apply a cross boundary and multi-year is going to be really, really beneficial. And I'll also note something really great about this project is that the San Bernardino County landowners are very supportive of this project. And it's kind of a rare case where they unanimously are cooperating with treatment. We don't have any gaps in treatment at people's homes, which is really great. I'll add that effective techniques for treating the species are hand pulling, but you have to be really careful because if you miss any of the plant material, it can resprout. And another important piece is getting the timing right and getting the plants in the spring before they go to seed. Another effective technique is really that continued communication, collaboration, and monitoring as we get later into the project. And let's see. And I wanted to talk about the fact that the San Bernardino population occurs in the Deep Creek area, as I had mentioned. This is a really popular recreation area, and it also is home to the Pacific Crest Trail. And it's really likely that these populations were spread by hikers. So currently the Deep Creek area is closed by the Forest Service because it was impacted by a lot of overuse. So we have this rare opportunity where people are not allowed back there. So it's a moment to get control over the population and think about a long-term education and containment strategy there. Looking to the future, we're currently working to secure some funding that will allow us to treat multiple years and across land boundaries so that we're doing a way more holistic treatment. And also this year, the San Bernardino National Forest completed a herbicide NEPA for invasive species. So they'll be utilizing herbicide on these treatments for the first time, and we'll see how that goes for them. Again, we're continuing to meet and stay collaborated and communicative. And, I'm here today to spread the word about garlic mustard and the work we're doing, because that's so important. And if you're wondering what you can do to help, clean your boots, document things in CalFlora and iNaturalist, and just be really active in feed alerts. But yeah, I just want to say thank you to anyone who worked on this, because a lot of people came together to make sure that these EDRR treatments happened. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. So I think folks will be holding questions until the end. So yeah, I was really dismayed to hear that garlic mustard made it to California a few years ago, but it's great that you guys are doing such good work. Our next speaker is Ellen Pimentel from Applied River Science. And I'm sorry, I don't have your bio, so I will let you tell the crowd more about yourself.
Thank you. Well, we can start. Yes, so I'm Ellen Pimentel. I work with Applied River Science, formerly known as I'm a plant ecologist and host, and get my presentation up. I'm going to talk about some really cool stuff. It's the last session of the last day, so thanks for being here. And I know that we all like to do things, so I'm going to tell you about some things we did. And this happened at the Arau Redwoods Gateway project. So if you were in the session with Save the Redwoods League yesterday, you heard a little bit about this. It's a super cool project. And I'm just going to talk about one little part of it. And I want to acknowledge that I'm reporting to you on the work of guided mostly by John Bear and people that came before me at Applied River Sciences and a lot of partners. I came into the project last August, so this was right at the end of implementation, and I got to see it be wrapped up, and I got to do the observations and documentation for like the success of the project. But I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of other folks, and this work was done in collaboration with the Yurok Tribe, with Cal Trout, Save the Redwoods League, Red National and State Parks, and many others. So, we're gonna do GoPro. There we go. So yeah, we're down here in Fortuna at the south end of Humboldt County. Yeah, we're down there, and the project's up here, up by Oric, by Redwood National Park. And the inset map here is turned on its side, so north is going that way. It's right along the 101, right at the confluence of Redwood Creek and Prairie Creek. So this took more than 5 years of planning, 5 years of implementation, 125 acres, less than 4 miles from the ocean. So this site represents the last downstream opportunity for floodplain and rearing habitat for salmonids, because just downstream of here, there's flood control levees that block any access to wetlands or backwater habitats. So every fish moving upstream and downstream has to go through this site. It was developed as a timber mill in 1953. Before that, used for farming and grazing. And of course, before that and throughout and during and in the future, stewarded by the Yurok people. And it is being returned to the Yurok people any day now, which is so So for the restoration project, because if you were in the session yesterday, you heard this is a lot going on out at this site. There's a cultural center being built alongside this, but for the restoration project, our goals were to physically enhance processes of the stream channels, the floodplain, and the uplands, mostly for the benefit of salmonids, also for native wildlife and native vegetation. Just realized I'm talking really fast. The restoration actions were to realign that Prairie Creek channel, moving it away from the highway, creating new backwater features, lowering the existing pasture down to reconnect to the floodplain, and then a revegetation program aimed at creating a forested wetland complex on the site. And there was a special focus on creating this zero velocity or slow moving or still water habitat for coho salmon. Other target species were Chinook salmon, steelhead, and cutthroat trout. And this map here is just to show you that all the different phases of the project, so multiple phases across multiple years throughout implementation. So it's a really complex implementation process. So for the invasive species management piece of the restoration project, the overall goal, at first, actually, I want to define invasive species because different people mean different things when they say this. So for this project, the definition was species that threaten the success of the project that we're trying to create. And that'll be relevant in a little bit. So we were trying to minimize the occurrence of invasive species in the project areas where there's ground disturbance and create persistent native plant communities. So we removed invasive plants and disposed of them wherever feasible in the project footprint. And then revegetation was done at high densities to provide quick shade on the ground, cover for the fish, and inhibit any invasive species reestablishment. And then a vegetation management program was run alongside the implementation of the project to ensure success. Again, with a primary focus on preventing impacts to that coho habitat that we were creating. So the invasive plant management was guided by a treatment plan written in 2022. This identified initial priority species for treatment. It recommended treatment methods following a pretty standard integrated pest management approach with a whole host of active treatments as well as passive treatments. And the ones in bold are the ones I'm going to talk about today. So mechanical excavation and burial during construction and grading. So at that as a part of the ground disturbance, it was invasive plant management. And then followed by this high density planting and ground cover treatment, including layered mulch. It also defined monitoring metrics and a schedule following a early detection rapid framework. A biological monitor was present during construction while invasive plant removal was taking place to make sure that everything was going well. And then we had dedicated spring and fall monitoring periods to map the invasives on the site, look at how effective the treatments were, and then use that to guide the recommendations for the following season. And this followed an adaptive management framework. So all of this monitoring information was being taken back to an adaptive management committee, which included, us like kind of on the planning monitoring side, and then as well as folks on the ground implementing the work, which included almost entirely tribal folks. So the priority species for treatment identified in the plan, they were prioritized based on their level of invasiveness and their prevalence on the site. And again, invasiveness means threatening the success of the project. So the priority one species were like, they're really invasive, they're here on the site, and they're threatening the success of our project. And our primary focus was on those species that could affect that coho habitat we were trying to create, that slow moving or still water. So this included reed canary grass and water manna grass, especially. And then priority two, they're invasive, they're on the site, but they're maybe not a threat to objectives at the time. And then this was, adjusted during the project implementation as conditions on the ground changed, and just to make sure that we're catching the new things coming up and, not worrying so much about things that are being well controlled. All right, our first novel method. I don't know if it's like totally novel, but like it's pretty cool. the mechanical removal and burial during construction as a part of that earthwork, the ground disturbance, whole plants were excavated, like targeted and excavated, including their root systems, and then buried in designated disposal pits, at least 3 meters deep. And this was really effective for plants that are notoriously difficult to control, like Himalayan blackberry, Himalayan knotweed, and the reed canary grass. And I have a picture of the reed canary grass here. So it's just filling in this channel, and this is exactly the kind of habitat we want to have open up for coho. So just a little bit more about the reed canary grass, Valliere arundinacea. It's a tad controversial, but we do consider it native to Humboldt County. There's papers and stuff about it, but it is, prolific and widespread throughout Humboldt County, and it's considered native, but it is perennial, rhizomatous, aggressive, and it really likes these moist habitats, and it will really quickly fill in these seasonal channels, these backwaters, these ponds. So it was a priority 1 species in the treatment plan, and our goal was control in the restoration area, not eradication, because it's around, it's going to be around, but we want to keep it out of these areas. So, like I said, I came in last year, which for the earlier phases of the project was year 5. So phase 1 is where we're seeing a lot of these monitoring results. And also I was building off the observations that had been made along the way in the prior 5 years. So it's kind of a combination of both that I'm able to report on here. Basically, we could see that the mechanical excavation was really successful in removing biomass. Because I mean, this, like I said, it used to be a pasture. It was covered with pasture grasses, tons of reed canary grass in the channel, tons of Himalayan blackberry, and getting all that biomass out with this targeted excavation during construction was really successful. But we did have a lot of resprouts, and the biomonitors that were on the site throughout construction observed that maybe the depths may have not been deep enough to get all those roots. But of course, this had to be balanced with, the volumes of fill being moved around on the site. We were sharing it with the cultural center being built, but yeah, there had to be that balance there. So we couldn't just necessarily dig everything out 8 feet deep. But that deep excavation immediately followed by the ground treatments that I'll talk about next and revegetation was really effective. And in fact, the year 5 cover requirements defined in our habitat management plan for the project were met 2 years later than expected. And that included at least 60% native cover and no more than 15% native cover. So that was really impressive. And then we did follow up with manual removal of vegetation areas where sprouts were coming. So the ground treatments. This is our layered mulch. I've also heard it called lasagna mulch, but I just heard Veronica's talk earlier about the lasagna things that's way more lasagna. So this is just layered. And from what I gathered, the types of materials, the layering of them, the depths, that was all played around with throughout implementation to find the best way to do it. But generally, it consisted of a cardboard layer covered by 12 to 20 centimeters of redwood bark mulch, in some places with a core fiber pinned over it, and just generally designed to limit any light hitting the surface and just space for plants to grow. And I just got a couple of photos up there. And so, yeah, you can imagine that this was a lot of material, over 125 acres. And I'm going to talk about this other novel method together because they go together. So the revegetation at high densities. So after the ground treatments are laid down, there was high density planting to provide that high cover quickly and kind of shade out and crowd out any invasives that were trying to come up. This was a multi-layered planting plan. So we had herbaceous species to provide that fast cover. And that was actually Carex nucta or sluice sedge was really successful in that, just really vigorous. And then interspersed with shrubs and trees to provide a longer term cover. So, any young invading plants were forced to compete with these larger native plants as container stock and plugs. and along with those ground trees. So this was really effective at preventing dominance of the reed canary grass that we were especially concerned about. And it also allowed for some loss due to elk. If you were in the session yesterday, the elk loved this project. They thought we were feeding them, I think. But you know, having all these plants out there gave us flexibility to just, you know, let them do their thing. I don't have time to go into my age. Yeah. So just the kind of overall takeaway for the passive treatments, you know, this was a lot of material and it was expensive up front, but like I said, it exceeded these short-term expectations on invasive plant control. And so, you know, having a layered ground treatment and a high density planting after you've taken out all this material, so you don't have those propagules anymore, that was expensive up front, but you're saving on that kind of ongoing manual labor that you might have needed if you hadn't done that at the front end to get this level of invasive plant control. I'm going to skip. So just, yeah, generally, you know, I think the adaptive management piece was really important too, having this really timely feedback loop with the committee, including people doing the work on the ground who could see it happening in real time and then making adjustments and trying out new things was really successful. Having a really flexible and open and creative team, I think was the key. So this photo is from phase 1. Photo I took in September, and I could hardly even tell it had been planted. It just looks like marsh. So I just want to thank the many project funders and partners. Hopefully I didn't get anyone. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Ellen. It's nice to hear about that really nice multi-pronged novel. Sorry, I would have done it, but oh, it's a different screen. It's making. Okay, thanks for sticking around, everyone. So your next speaker is me. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, I'm Justin Valliere. I'm an assistant professor of cooperative extension in invasive weed and restoration ecology at UC Davis. It's the longest professional title you can have. Right? And today I'm going to be talking about using targeted grazing to achieve multiple different restoration goals in invaded oak woodlands. So this was a project that came out of a collaboration with the Napa County Land Trust. They're the ones that initiated the research project. And the key conservation goals were several. So the first was to manage invasive plant species, largely invasive annual grasses. As you'll learn later in the talk, we didn't necessarily eliminate them from the system, but we did control the impacts that they have on fire risk as well as native plant diversity. The next goal is habitat enhancement or habitat restoration. So in these invaded oak woodland understories, there are very few native herbaceous species, forbs or wildflowers that are able to coexist. So we wanted to be able to enhance the abundance of and diversity of those plant species. And then a main motivation behind this work was to reduce fire risk in these oak woodlands, which we all know is increasingly a concern throughout California. And we wanted to see, like, can we integrate these three goals simultaneously? If you're interested in reading more about this, we published the paper last year, and I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on that paper. So Morgan did a lot of the initial data wrangling and data management. Tasha and Michael were the ones at the Land Trust that really initiated and managed the project. And then Jake was the botanical consultant that helped identify a lot of the plant species and collect the. So we wanted to see if we could reduce the abundance of those invasive annual grasses, enhance, I'm sorry, did I already say this? Yeah. Okay, here we go. So this took place at the Landfront Preserve, which is in the Coast Ranges of Napa County. This is just an overview here, and you can see pretty high density of oak trees, so about 70% closed canopy. So this wasn't like oak savanna, it was like rather closed canopy oak woodlands. And then understory of, you can see lots of thatch from various different invasive annual grasses. So you can imagine really high fire risk in a system like this, with the threat of it turning into crown fires, which would then, kill those oak trees. So our experimental design, we took two different approaches. So initially, there was plots installed within the interior of the preserve, where we had some that were fenced off and the goats or the sheep couldn't get into those exclosures. That became a little bit tricky for the herders to navigate. So we also installed plots. I say we, Michael and Tasha are the ones that did this part. Then we also installed paired plots along the perimeter. So you can see that fence line, that grazing exclosure, plots inside and outside for that were also matched pairs. So overall, 352 units surveyed. Most plots were surveyed at least 3 years, but there were some gaps in coverage over this period. But overall, really good replication across all those plots. And this is just what those exclosures look like. So it's portable fencing. The interior is just the meter squared plots where we actually measured vegetation composition, and then we put the fencing a bit further outside that to have a buffer so the animals can get in there. Initially, we started with goats, which they were effective, but goats turned out to be really difficult to manage. They also browse on woody vegetation more. So, if you're concerned also about oak recruitment or other woody species that are in the understory, not ideal. So I'm not saying that they're not useful in some contexts, but where you have a lot of natives that you want to protect as well might not be the best approach. So pretty soon after, the project switched to using sheep, which were much easier to manage and browse less on vegetation, and they just behaved from what folks say. So here's just an example of what these plots looked like. So you can see pre-grazing, a really thick layer of invasive grass thatch across the understory. And then post-grazing, after the fencing had been removed, you can see really little thatch, some bare ground. So they did a really good job browsing on the grasses. The statistical analysis, I don't want to go into much detail, but there were a lot of different things we wanted to control for. So we had those different plot types, right? The interior ones and then the perimeter ones. We had two different types of grazers, the goats and the sheep. It was a paired plot design. There were different random effects that we wanted to account for. So we used the linear mixed effect models. And we were largely interested in the abundance and the diversity of native plant species and non-native invasive plant species. And then we also used some multivariate statistics, and then conducted an indicator species analysis, which is a species level analysis to see if any individual species are associated with a given treatment, in this case, grazed or ungrazed plots. So first I'm showing percent cover of the natives and non-natives. So the natives are in the left panel in green, the non-natives, this is just all non-natives, grasses and forbs, in purple on the right. The dashed lines are the grazed plots, and then the solid lines are the ungrazed plots. So if you look at just overall native percent cover, and then just looking at native forbs as well, you can see that grazing really boosted the abundance of those species across all years of the study. And that those changes were almost entirely due to increases in native forb species or wildflower species. Native perennial bunch grasses were just not a dominant part of this community. I'm not saying historically they weren't there, but currently they aren't a major constituent of the community. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the panel, we actually didn't see a significant difference in non-native cover between grazed and ungrazed. And so I kind of hinted that at the beginning. Yes, it's reducing the abundance of thatch, which is a major limitation for native plant recruitment the following growing season, but it's not actually reducing like the seed bank there. And I think that's because we grazed after these grasses and other species that set seed. Then if we look at native plant richness, we see very similar patterns. On the left-hand side, the green lines are the native species. Again, the dashed lines are grazed, solid lines are ungrazed. So not only does grazing during summer or late summer, early fall increase the cover of native plant species, it increases overall native plant richness, which is another really promising sign. In the first year of the study, we did see some slight differences in terms of grazed versus ungrazed non-native species, largely driven by non-native forbs. But overall, not a whole lot of difference between non-native richness between grazed and ungrazed. These are some cherry-picked photos of some of our nicer plots. So if you see on the left-hand side, in the grazed plots, we see a lot of different, a large amount of native lupin species. And then the corresponding paired plot on the right-hand side, you can see just annual grass seedlings coming up, maybe some erodium as well. This is the results of an MDS, so like an ordination analysis. It's like looking at our plots in community space. So every circle on the right-hand side is an individual plot. And then the yellow circles are the grazed plots, the gray circles are the ungrazed plots. And so this analysis takes into account the abundance of every plant species that were recorded over the course of the study. And then it displays all of your plots in species space, essentially. So the closer two circles are together, the more compositionally similar they are. The further apart they are, the more different they are in terms of their plant composition. And what you can see, it's not a major shift, but there is a shift between the grazed plots and the ungrazed plots. And that's driven by increases in native forb diversity and cover in those grazed plots compared to the ungrazed plots. And then on the right-hand side, it's the same analysis, but you can plot species in that space or community space rather than plots. So same thing, the closer two points are together, the more similar the species driving that pattern are. And this just highlights too that those differences again were due to boosting the number of native plant species and the abundance of native plant species, and then to a minor degree some changes in non-native forb species largely. And then I think this is the last graph I'm showing. So this is the results of that indicator species analysis. It basically takes every single species that's in your data frame, and one by one, it looks for an association with one of your treatments. So in this case, is it associated with grazing or the ungrazed plots? And so, great, thanks. There were two species that were significantly associated with ungrazed. So that was a non-native brome. It's not one of the more problematic brome species. And then Clarkia inquiculata, so woodland Clarkia. So what that shows is those species are potentially negatively impacted by grazing. So it's promising to see only one native plant species there. And I think I know what's going on there. That's a really late flowering plant species, right? If you know that Clarkia. And so for most of our native forbs, they had already flowered, produced seed, dropped their seed, but that species might have been still in its reproductive phase. So that's possibly why we saw reductions in there. They weren't massive reductions, and I think overall there's a net benefit for native species, but grazing doesn't come without risks or non-target effects. But then if you look at all the species that are below that red dashed line, those are all the species that are positively associated with grazing, meaning that they increased in abundance. And so a lot of different native forb species, which is great. That was one of the goals of the project, but also some non-native forb species. And a lot of those non-native forb species were also nitrogen fixers, so trifolium species. So most of these species, aren't super problematic. So I don't see this as like a reason to abandon this approach, especially if you're also achieving benefits for those native plant species while simultaneously reducing fire risk. And the mechanisms are probably really similar, right? The things that are the increased light availability, reduced competition potentially, that's going to benefit native species as well as non-native forb species that are in the system. Yeah, and those are the two species. I should have shown that earlier. And another thing too is a lot of the species that seem to benefit are these like lower grown rosette species. Okay, so overall, the key findings are that dry season grazing with small ruminants, probably sheep more so than goats. I mean, goats do a good job, but like I said, they're problematic. Is an effective approach for reducing wildfire risk in oak woodlands of California. So that's a positive. Sheep are probably preferable to goats because they're easier to manage and they browse less on woody vegetation. I will say we didn't capture a lot of oak seedlings within our plots, and that could be a concern, right? Like through trampling or herbivory. So if you were going to take this approach, and recruitment at your site is a really big issue, fencing off individuals or other approaches might be needed. Grazing doesn't seem to reduce invasive grass cover like during the growing season. Yeah, it reduces thatch. But that is still a benefit for native forbs because again, you're reducing that thatch layer, which we know is a major inhibitor of emergence and survival of native species. And then grazing might also have some non-target effects, so it might promote the abundance of non-native forbs, but some of those are desirable forage. So if you're on working lands, this could actually be a benefit as well. Okay. And then I'd just like to acknowledge the funding from the NRCS through the Conservation Innovation Grant Program, the sheep outfit that helps with this, with the grazing treatments, and then everybody from the Land Trust of Napa County that assisted the project. I think we're okay on time. Okay, so now we will. So the now on all methods of or if you insist on yeah. That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but that is a major limitation. You know, there's a ton of growing interest in using sheep, but it's not like with other livestock, you're not making money, right? Like you're paying a lot of money. So that's an important concern. Yeah.
So that's this question. I was wondering, I think you mentioned that long rental classes.
Yep.
So do you have a sense for how to use grazing sheep? What do you think would be the best timing to try this?
Well, I mean, you're talking, so your concern is like non-target effects on the native perennial grasses. I mean, I think if you're doing active restoration, like they need to be established adults, I would think, or otherwise they're probably not going to make it, right? Because we know that first summer is the critical life stage of those grasses. So maybe like staggering your grazing, like maybe doing a restoration somewhere, not grazing that first, you're getting that established. But you know, I've done similar work with like mowing, late season spring mowing, and if you time it right, you can reduce impacts on native bunch grass reproduction. They do resprout, and in some cases they get grazed and they even do better because of transitory growth. So I hope I answered your question. Okay. Any for Michelle or Ellen? Sorry, I forgot where to pass it.
I had a question for Ellen about the reed canary grass and how you were talking about how you removed it even though it's native, and that's a bit controversial. Like if you could touch on how you made decisions to remove it even though it's a native.
Yeah, so the controversy is whether it's native. There's folks that believe that it's not, or maybe it's a hybrid with something like from the East Coast. So not so controversial to remove it, but whether or not it is native or it's any kind of concern for not totally eradicating it. But the research that we did showed that the plants in Humboldt County are probably and you know, it's kind of a land management decision, and we're trying to create this nice habitat for the coho in the same place that the reed canary grass just wants to fill it. It's in plenty of places, so we can take it out here where we're trying to get the fish in.
It's not.
It's novel.
I have a question for, oh, sorry, I'll get to you once, for Michelle. Do we know the source of introduction for those garlic mustard?
Justin, it's thought that probably hikers introduced it, because in both cases, it's in an area that gets a lot of hiking information. Yes, including boots.
Considering chemical herbicide controls for those invasive.
Yeah, so a variety of active treatments were done on the site, including chemical treatment that was really targeted and specific. So we treated Canada thistle, so definitely Canada thistle. There was also the water angrass that I mentioned. That's really well treated with herbicides. We weren't able to do it as often as we wanted because of the flooding, which is what we wanted. It's part of the project. And then poison hemlock a little bit in the last year too. So yeah, just a wide variety of approaches and trying to find what worked best for which plants and where.
I have a question for Justin for some great talk. With your study design, you're looking at thatch. Do you think if you were to have the treatment be in grasses while they were alive, would you see a similar effect or a different effect?
I mean, outcomes of grazing are really context dependent. So, it depends on the timing, it depends on the intensity, depends on the climate and the rainfall year. I think in this case, our goals were really aimed at reductions in fire risk. There's a great review paper. Carla D'Antonio is second author. I forget the name of the first author, but it talks about all that context dependence and all these different outcomes of grazing. But yeah, I don't know if I answered. You could, there are some studies that show that grazing during the growing season can help shift from grass dominated to forest dominated, but that's not like universally true. And you could potentially have non-target effects on your native folks thereafter. And I think that's why that was such a plus for our study. It's like, oh, we don't have any non-target effects. And in fact, we help the native plant diversity. And, we're never going to eradicate invasive annual grasses in California. The key is really to minimize impacts. And that was the primary. Is there a mic?
I'm wondering if you consider after reducing that biomass of putting fire on them, bringing that back to reduce the resource damage.
Certainly, I think there's a lot of folks in Northern California and elsewhere that are interested in doing that. And you can get similar outcomes with fire and grazing, but they can also be distinct. So again, timing is key, I think. It depends on your grass species too. Some things like Avena shatter, so if you do a fall strike burn, their seeds might already be dispersed. Other grasses, their inflorescences are still seeds. When you do your burn, it might not. So again, timing is key.
Hi, I'm sorry. I have a question for Ellen. You had mentioned here mechanical burial, and it reminded me of the horizon flipping that they're doing at Reyes for the basic beach grass. But one of the differences is that you have the designated dump pits. I was wondering how you were able to identify where they were doing those digs in the first place, and kind of where to try to get the least amount of resprouting impact.
Yeah, I wasn't involved in finding the designated disposal pits, but I think they were just in the areas that are being worked that phase or that year, but that would eventually be part of the project, so they would be, covered up with more soil or fill or whatever. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? Was that all? Okay. Yeah, I think it was just kind of out of the way, not going to be disturbed during that course of the phase. And yeah, having them designated so that it could be monitored for resprouts there. So you know, the file monitor knows like I need to check that like weekly or whatever for respawns of the disposal pit.
This question is for you, Ellen, too, just to tag onto that. It's hard to wrap my mind around thinking about the disposal areas and, yeah. What's the risk or thought process around like as that plant material decomposes, and will there be depressions in the ground or having to refill?
That's a really good question. I'm looking at someone else who's been on the project club.
So we dumped them a couple different places, some just pits that were again not going to be disturbed otherwise and filled up, so we weren't really concerned. Questions were made there. Doesn't matter, and then we also put them, so we also moved the actual channel, and where the old channel was, we did put buried it there as well. And so ultimately it really didn't matter if it depressed a little bit. Yeah, and all of those sites have we put plants on top, native plants.
At least 3 meters.
Sorry, I didn't get.
But like how deep was the hole, and then the amount of stacked.
Oh yeah, I wasn't there when it was actually being buried, but it definitely was down at the bottom. And we had specifications that it had to be buried at least 8 feet deep. No. Soil, yeah, so soil, 8 feet, soil, plant material underneath it. The channel itself was very deep. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. Sean did all the revegetation today. And there's Amy who did the invasive. Very much a team effort.
Any last question? Yeah.
Understanding opportunity to you treated plants before they went to seed in their second year. For instance, in San Bernardino, you targeted seedlings and plants before they went to seed. I was wondering if that was because you had a lower success rate in treating, or if you were just trying to.
Yes, that's a great question. It is because basically the treatment window and the availability of labor was limited, right? So in that first treatment year, they had to start later than planned because our federal funding was paused. Once they got out there, realized the scope and scale of the infestation and how much they had, they realized that it was the best use of their time to focus on getting those second plans. And yeah, and go that way. So that's where they decided to focus their efforts and then map those seedlings so that they can get to them the next year. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, we were an impeccably timed session, and I will let everybody go. It's now 5 o'clock. So thank you very much for this.
Can make it actually, it's like, is because we got Worcester awards and we got raffle, which we're gonna crank through so fast, but if you want to stretch your legs, that's great, but we're gonna open up this big